Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan, and a happy 4th of July to everybody out there in the U.S. that's celebrating today and citizens abroad. If you're playing this at a barbecue or a party, then I'd like to say hello to your friends and relatives that are surely disinterested in anything that I'm talking about. But thanks so much, and thanks for having me be part of your celebration today. Of course, it would be great to get to a time where the 4th of July is no longer known as an American holiday, but as the day where the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night, we will not vanish without a fight, we're going to live on, we're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day, but right now it is still American. So thanks so much for joining me, and let's get to the box office for this past weekend. It is kind of still an ongoing weekend. Warner Brothers and Sony, in particular for the major studios, did not report final totals for the Friday through Sunday window, but everybody else did. So we are using the dreaded estimates for some of these numbers. And let's look at the box office top 10, starting of course with Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which came in on the lower end of the lowered expectations as the movie approached release, with $60.3 million. We are going to talk a lot about this, as I'm sure you can imagine, on this episode, but this is an opening where if the movie cost $150 million or even $200 million, it might be one of those things like, well, okay, yeah, it's an all right opening. Let's see where it goes. But this movie was so heinously expensive, it could only be considered a successful opening if it had had a great box office opening. I'm talking $120 million plus, and that's not at all where we went. So there's a lot more to talk about there. In second place is Elemental, which had a nice hold once again, staying in second place at the box office, a 34.2% drop and a $12.1 million total. Its overall total now is approaching $90 million. It may get to $100 million by the time we're done with the July 4th holiday. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse back down to number 3 this weekend with an estimated total of $12 million in its 5th week of release, a 37% drop, and a total approaching $350 million now. No Hard Feelings stays in 4th place with a 48% drop in week 2 and a $7.8 million estimated total. Its overall domestic total is now close to $30 million. Transformers Rise of the Beast stays at number 5 with a 37.4% drop in week 4 and a $7.3 million total. This movie's had decent legs, but it was another one of those heinously expensive ones. $136.4 million total domestic right now. In 6th place is Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, with an opening of just over $5.5 million. And this represents the worst opening of all time for DreamWorks Animation. And this includes Spirit Untamed and The Croods: The New Age, which are both animated films that opened when theaters were barely opening at a time of very depressed moviegoing. Here we're back in full swing, and you have the worst opening in the history of the division. Maybe they wanted to let Pixar off the hook. I'm not really quite sure. Obviously, there was a marketing issue here because people just weren't excited about this film. They weren't buzzing about it. It's really been feast or famine for animation since theaters have opened back up. They're either big hits like Minions: The Rise of Gru or Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, or disappointments. And this is a box office disappointment. The only silver lining to this cloud is this is not a Elemental type movie that costs $200 million, but still not great news, and another in a litany of bad box office stories this summer. In 7th place, still hanging around, is The Little Mermaid in its 6th week of release with a 36.9% drop from last week and a $5.3 million total. Its domestic total right now is at $281 million. Can it get to that $300 million? We'll see. Good gracious, The Flash. A 65% drop in week 3 after a massive drop last week and a $5.2 million total for 8th place. The Little Mermaid did more in its 6th week than The Flash did in its 3rd week. It's almost at $100 million domestic, but it is losing theaters left and right. It was a terrible debut. It was a terrible week 2. It was an atrocious week 3, and it's probably going to be out of the top 10 next week. Or if it is in the top 10, it's just barely going to be clinging on. Box office disaster. That's really all there is to it. Indiana Jones may be on its heels. Let's see how it legs out. But just an absolute car crash, a wreck. Nothing good to say. The Flash is just a mess. Just a big mess. In ninth place is Asteroid City. It drops 52.8%, a little steeper than you might expect for an older skewing indie film. $4.2 million for its third week, its second week in wide release, and an $18.6 million total. And hanging around the top 10 is the movie that kicked off the summer, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. In its ninth week of release, a 41.7% drop, a total just over $2 million, and its box office total is now at $355+ million. Dropping out of the top 10 this week after 4 weeks is the horror film The Boogeyman, and after 2 weeks is the horror spoof The Blackening. So if you had a horror movie that was the and then a B word, you are out of the top 10 this week. This is what I like to call our road to recovery, and it looked like we were on a road to recovery earlier this summer, but it's not looking so great now. That blue line is the box office weekend average for 2015 through 2019. The red line is the box office weekend average for 2021 and 2022, and you can see that this past weekend we were below the average, not just for the 5 years preceding the pandemic, but for the past couple of years as well. We're not just underperforming where the box office was pre-pandemic, we're doing worse than we were last summer, and I believe I was reading that the total box office this summer is lagging behind last summer, which is just, when you look at the size and the number of movies that have come out, it just goes to show you that we are hitting flop after flop after flop, or at the very minimum, box office disappointment. There have been very few runaway successes this summer. We are halfway through. There's a lot of hope for Mission Impossible. There's a lot of hope for Barbie. There's a lot of hope for Oppenheimer. And then maybe there will be a movie that comes in and surprises us. Haunted Mansion, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Blue Beetle if there's a miracle and lightning strikes. But this has been an extraordinarily disappointing summer this far. Maybe one of the worst summers in Hollywood history from a box office loss perspective. And I think there's going to be a lot of post-mortem once Labor Day hits. Let's look at the 2023 summer box office chart. For now, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is still the number 1 movie of the summer at just over $355 million, but Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is nipping at its heels at $340.3 million. The Little Mermaid, like I said, it's been hanging around, quietly getting to $281.2 million domestic. Again, if it hadn't been so horribly expensive, then it might be a different box office story. Fast X is there at number 4 at $145.5, really number 4 by default. Transformers Rise of the Beast, though, may be looking to eclipse it. It's at $136.4 million. The Flash hanging around at number 6 at $99.4 million. Elemental, which now seems almost guaranteed to outgross The Flash domestically, at $89.6 million. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny debuts on the chart at $60.3 million in 8th place. The Boogeyman drops down 1 place to 9th. No Hard Feelings stays at 10th. And Book Club: The Next Chapter drops out of the 2023 summer box office top 10. Looking at my predictions versus the actual summer box office, again, right now I only have 2 movies that I predicted in the correct spot, although I think that's going to go down to maybe 1 or maybe 0 by the next show, because I think Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is going to move up to number 1, and I think that Elemental will be moving up this chart. So once again, maybe like last summer, I will predict none of the movies almost in their correct positions, and then The Flash, golly, I picked it number 4 for the summer. I thought that maybe picking Little Mermaid number 1 would be my biggest mistake, but if my number 4 movie doesn't even make the summer box office top 10, which is looking like a very real possibility, well then that's pretty embarrassing. Although I was not the only one that was believing the hype on this film. Looking at the race for number 1 this summer, unless people just stop going to see Spider-Man like literally right now, then it is going to stay ahead of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 for that number 1 spot. It's about to cross $350 million. Depending on how long it sticks around, we could be looking at $375. Maybe it starts kind of lapping at the shores of $400 million. And then the big question is there another movie that's going to come in and potentially take that number 1 spot? Could it be Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1? Could it be Barbie? The hype is building to a fever pitch on Barbie. If that thing catches fire, there's no telling what's going to happen. So this number 1 race is not finished. Like I said, we're only halfway through the summer, but right now, the staying power of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and that's been what the most impressive thing about this movie has been, not just its opening, but its ability to stick around, no pun intended, that is going to land it temporarily or perhaps permanently at the number 1 spot for the summer. Looking outside the domestic marketplace, these were the top 5 films internationally internationally. At number 1, the box office run for China's Lost in the Stars continues. It banked another $117.3 million. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny coming in disappointingly internationally as it did domestically at $70 million. Elemental banking $29.8 million, followed by the Chinese film Never Say Never at $25.1 million, and Transformers Rise of the Beast at $14.9 million. When you combine those international grosses with the domestic grosses, we get our worldwide top 5, and Indiana Jones does come out on top there with a worldwide debut of $130.3 million. Lost in the Stars is bumped down to number 2 at $117.3. That's all from China. Then Elemental at number 3 with $41.9 million as it continues to play around the world. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is in 4th place with $25.8 million. And then once again, the Chinese film Never Say Never in 5th place at $21.1 million. So let's talk about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny and where it sits in the Indiana Jones franchise and at the summer box office. And let's look first of all at what it means for Harrison Ford as far as his box office openings. Looking at Harrison Ford's top 5 opening weekends domestically, people might be surprised. His movies tend to be slow burns because he's only had 2 films that have debuted unadjusted for inflation above $100 million. Of course, Star Wars The Force Awakens, which debuted to $247.9 million, and then Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull back in May of 2008, which debuted to $100.1 million, although that number would assuredly have been much higher had it not opened on a Thursday. And opening weekend numbers means its first Friday through Sunday stretch. This is a trend for Indiana Jones movies. It's the exception rather than the rule that the movie opens on a Friday. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is actually Harrison Ford's 3rd highest opening weekend of all time at $60.3 million, followed by 2019's The Secret Life of Pets 2 at $46.6 million, and then 1997's Air Force One at $37.1 million. Of course, an actor who has been around as long as Harrison Ford. I'm not just going to let those numbers lie there. I'm going to adjust for inflation. And when you look at his 5 highest grossing weekends adjusted for inflation, and these are credited roles only, by the way, so Rise of Skywalker doesn't count. Star Wars The Force Awakens is still on top at $318.1 million, followed by $141.4 million adjusted for Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Then we have Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade back in May of 1989, which had an opening weekend of $90.8 million, but that movie opened on a Wednesday, so it had 2 full days of release before its quote-unquote opening weekend. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in 1984 also opened on Wednesday, but is number 4 on Harrison Ford's list with $74.1 million, and then Air Force One from 1997, still there at number 5 with $70.3 million adjusted. So when you look at Harrison Ford's top opening weekends adjusted, 3 of the 5 are Indiana Jones films, and really Raiders of the Lost Ark almost doesn't count because the release structure was completely different than it was even a few years later when Temple of Doom came out. When we look at the franchise tracker for Indiana Jones, the 5 films that have been released, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull has the highest opening 3-day weekend, again, even though it opened on Thursday at $100.1 million. Dial of Destiny, unadjusted for inflation, comes in 2nd place at $60.3 million, followed by Last Crusade with $37 million and Temple of Doom at $25 million, again, with the caveat that they opened on a Wednesday. Then Raiders of the Lost Ark. This is a much more slow burn way of making money because it made a lot of money, $8.3 million opening back in 1981. When you look at those opening weekends adjusted for inflation, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull comes in at $141.4 million, Last Crusade at $90.8 million, Temple of Doom at $74.1 million, then Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny in 4th place at $60.3 million, and Raiders of the Lost Ark coming in at $27.7 million. Looking at all 5 films by total domestic gross, unadjusted for inflation, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, as much as people still talk about it, is number 1, $317.1 million back in the summer of 2008, followed by Raiders of the Lost Ark with $225.6 million, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade at $197.1 million, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom at $179.8 million, which means that Dial of Destiny is going to have to leg out 3 times its opening weekend to beat any other Indiana Jones film unadjusted for inflation before you even start doing all of those calculations. Based off of the B+ cinema score, the mediocre reviews, and the low opening, I think that that's a long shot. You never know. It may strike a chord. There may be some older audience members that waited to go see it that could boost up those grosses a little bit later on down the line. But I don't know. I think that that's doubtful. It has a long road ahead just to even be comparable to any other Indiana Jones film box office wise. And it's definitely not going to happen when you look at these grosses adjusted for inflation, because Raiders of the Lost Ark is tops with $755 million adjusted, followed by Temple of Doom with $526.5 million and Last Crusade with $483.5 million. Then the number one movie, unadjusted for inflation, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, comes in fourth place with $447.9 million. And then you see Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. It only needs to make about, $390 million more to match the fourth lowest film in the franchise, which it is not going to do. It's probably going to come in well below. And when I say well below, I mean, we're talking $300 million lower than the last film adjusted for inflation in the franchise. That's not exactly, I don't think, what Lucasfilm and Disney had in mind when they decided to do one last Indiana Jones adventure. Finally, looking at the franchise by worldwide gross, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is at number one with $786.6 million. And really, it's the only comparable film as far as release structure, because 2008 was the beginning of the super global Hollywood era. There were always European markets, etc., where most films went when the original Indiana Jones trilogy came out, but there were new markets available to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and that are available to Dial of Destiny that the original three didn't have. In third place worldwide is Last Crusade, and again, remember, these are unadjusted for inflation with $474.1 million. Then Raiders, which made $367.4 million. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom at $333 million. And then Dial of Destiny, which has opened with $130.3 million. So another $200 million. It could match, unadjusted for inflation, what Temple of Doom did back in 1984. We'll just have to see. By the way, for anybody wondering why I don't list it as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's because no movie by that name exists. I don't care what Disney says or what any streaming service says or what any DVD or Blu-ray cover says. There is no such film as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. There is only Raiders of the Lost Ark. So regardless of budget, this wouldn't be the best box office news for Dial of Destiny, and there's a lot of questions about it. What was the reason that people didn't go see this movie? This will be endlessly dissected and discussed and debated, and I've seen a lot of different theories about it. But the thing that is sinking this movie, and it is the storyline of this summer, is the ruinous production cost behind it. Let's look at its path to profitability, or as I call it, Indiana Jones and the Tentpole of Doom. This is its theatrical profit given market estimates for what comes back from different markets. Now keep in mind, this is theatrical grosses only. There were reportedly about $90 million worth of partnerships with this film, stuff that movies like The Flash didn't really have. That doesn't go on here. This is only money coming back from the theatrical window, but keep in mind, and as we've been saying in the last several weeks, studios definitely want movies to break even theatrically, because that means that everything else, merchandising and partnership deals, etc., that all goes on top of that profit margin. Well, they've got a big hole that they've dug for themselves over at Lucasfilm and Disney with this movie. Let's look at where we are so far. Of course, it's only a few days into release. $2.3 million from the Chinese market. It's basically DOA there. About $500,000 coming back to investors from that market. A 40% share of the international market so far translates to about $27 million. And then a 60% share of its opening weekend box office comes in at about $36.2 million. But the budget for this movie, I was able to find a reliable source, an industry source, that quoted the budget at around $325 million, which was higher than has been quoted in the past several weeks. So that's the number that I'm going with. A minimum advertising cost of $100 million. That means that you have $425 million sunk into this movie before it even hits theaters. That is insane. James Cameron can get away with that for Avatar: The Way of Water, but that's about it. The fact that it's mind-blowing to me that you would put this much money into any movie. Currently, the gross stands at about $170 million worldwide. Right now, the net from that gross, meaning the money that comes back to the investors, is $63.8 million. When you put that up against the $425 million cost, that means that to break even theatrically, you would need to bring in $361.1 million net. This movie might not make $361.1 million gross, meaning before you take out any cut to the theaters, etc. This is going to be a huge money loser, barring some kind of a miracle for Disney. And as we've talked about on the show, they already have 2 or 3 other fairly big money losers that they've put out this year, as have so many of the other studios. Paramount with Transformers Rise of the Beast, though not to this level. WB with The Flash, this is comparable. We'll see how those two shake out. But this has just been one of those summers where the bad box office news is just compounded. It's like getting punched in the face and then slapped in the face right after. But it's also kind of a self-inflicted wound because studios have been pumping money into movies like this as if we were still in peak 2019 Avengers Endgame MCU era. That would be a tall order if there hadn't been a pandemic, if they hadn't all decided to change the viewing habits of their consumers and get them to watch streaming, and then get them to not watch streaming, get them back to theaters. Maybe this is just a hangover from the pre-pandemic era and we'll see these budgets go down, but this is just ludicrous. I get Empire sent to me from over in the UK, the magazine Empire. It's a great magazine since Entertainment Weekly died. This is the one that I read, and it's got some great stories, but it gets to me a little bit delayed because it has to ship from overseas. So I was just reading a story about the big tuk-tuk chase in Dial of Destiny, and one of the screenwriters on the film, they were interviewing him, and he said, well, the great thing about writing for an Indiana Jones film is that nobody ever comes in the room and says, you can't do that, it's too expensive. Well, you know what? Maybe someone should have been doing that, because look at the budgets for the Indiana Jones franchise. These are adjusted for inflation. Raiders of the Lost Ark, $66.9 million adjusted for inflation. It made over 10 times that domestically. Temple of Doom, $82.4 million. Last Crusade, $117.7 million. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, a big jump, $261.3 million. And then an even bigger jump to Dial of Destiny at $325 million. Now, some people might say, well, yeah, each movie you step up in budget. But that much? I mean, especially when you look at Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, back in 2008, if you adjust that money for inflation, it was the 4th highest grossing film in the franchise. And I know that the hope is always with this last movie, well, people are going to really still want to see it. They still love Indiana Jones, but you don't know that. And that wasn't a very well-received movie. So to escalate the budget as much as they did, even from Crystal Skull, which had a drop-off from Last Crusade, that to me says that you thought this movie was bulletproof, that people are going to show up for Harrison Ford, they're going to show up for Indiana Jones. I understand that you have a little bit of a budget bloat because of COVID protocols and you can't really help that. But if you had a $150 million budgeted movie that had its budget bloated $50 million due to COVID so that it was a $200 million movie, that's still okay. That's the thing that's so weird. We talk about box office flops in this movie and that movie, and so much of it is budget based. It's not that nobody's going to the movies. People are still going to the movies. These openings, if the budgets had been different, would be decent at least, or they would have a chance to leg out a profit or at least not be a huge bomb. The reason this summer seems so catastrophic is because we have movies that are opening to $50, $60 million that have $200, $300, $400 million budgets. That's insanity. And I hope that the one thing that the studios take away from this summer is learning how to make a movie for less. These budgets are not necessary. They are absolutely not necessary. These movies don't look better. They aren't written better. This has been such a mediocre level of quality. There's so many movies, I didn't hate Indiana Jones. I didn't hate The Flash. I didn't hate Transformers Rise of the Beast. I didn't hate Elemental, but I didn't love any of them either. So the increase in cost isn't yielding a better product. So this is going to be a summer that I think, like I say, a lot of people are going to be dissecting and trying to figure things out. But I think the lesson is pretty simple. Make better movies and make them for less. Boy, we have a lot of charts left to get to. That was a bit of a rant. Let's get back to some of the updates on the box office top 10. Elemental, a couple updates here. When you look at its domestic gross adjusted for inflation, it finally passed Onward. Yay! So it's now the second lowest grossing Pixar film of all time if you adjust for inflation. Also, when you look at it by worldwide gross, it's past Turning Red, Lucas, Soul, and Onward. And it's creeping up now on Lightyear, so it could hit that number 22. Although it's a tall order still to get up to The Good Dinosaur at $333.7 million. And I made some errors on my Elemental profit sheet last week, so I want to correct that very quickly. Like I said, it's been very heartening that it has held so well from week to week, but the problem again is how much this movie costs to make. When you look at what it's brought in, $3.19 million from China, $33.5 million when you take the box office cut out internationally, and then another $28.2 million from its first week domestically, $16.7 million from week 2, and $6 million from its past weekend. But the budget was $200 million, $100 million to advertise it. That's a cost of $300 million. They've brought in $87.7 million estimated net, which means to break even in the theatrical window, theatrical profits only, you still need to bring in $212.2 million. If this had been an animated film made for $65 or even $75 million, then it would be in a much different place financially. Some people say like, well, Dan, Pixar doesn't make movies that cheap. Well, they don't, but maybe they could figure it out. I don't know. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse has been the oasis for the box office analyst in me, the one that likes to talk about great things about movies, because that has been doing really well. And let's actually look at where it stands when you look at its domestic box office total. It is now one of the 5 highest grossing films ever released in the Spider-Man franchise. It's jumped ahead of Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man 3 when you don't adjust for inflation. Of course, we'll keep updating the adjusted for inflation list. It's at $340.3 million. If it keeps going like it's going, it's possible that it could pass that $373.5 million gross for Spider-Man 2. And then if it keeps going past that, you could be getting up to Spider-Man Far From Home and 2002 Spider-Man territory, although that's a lot of webs left to spin for it. That'd be another $60 million or so. But still, thank goodness, this is a movie that has done well. Now, there has been some controversy in the last week or so. There was a story that came out about the animators on the film and the working conditions. This is something that we've had with VFX artists. Also, some questions about that budget. Is it as low as has been reported? If I can find reliable sources that tell me that the budget was higher than $100 million, then I will update that chart and the profitability and everything else. And obviously, I don't agree with the whole mentality of, get this done at any cost. There's always a work crush that comes with production, but I think that something that people have been doing and should do more is working on that balance of like, well, you can ask animators to work 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, but should you be asking them to do that? And what's the sacrifice and how can you figure that out? So that's a discussion that's been going on. The other big thing is the prospect of it missing its release date beyond the Spider-Verse next spring, missing its release date. It looks like that is likely to happen at that point, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get an announcement on that pretty soon, because work apparently is not very far along on that film, and it's on the slate for next spring. Transformers Rise of the Beast has been hanging around, and it gets a little bit of a moral victory here. It has now passed, unadjusted for inflation, the domestic totals of Bumblebee and Transformers the Last Night, so it'll go down in the record books as the 5th highest grossing Transformers film behind the first 4 Michael Bay films. So, good for Rise of the Beast. Speaking of moral victories, The Flash, adjusted for inflation, has now passed Birds of Prey. So, congratulations, Flash. You're going to be the 9th highest grossing film in the DCEU, maybe 10th once Aquaman comes out, maybe 11th once Blue Beetle comes out, and probably the biggest money loser. So, yay. So as I mentioned, this is technically a long weekend, and July 4th is very weird because box office-wise, it's kind of counted on where the 4th falls. So if the 4th is on a Sunday, then the 4th of July weekend is like July 2nd through the 4th. But if the 4th is on a Tuesday, like it is this year, then the 4th of July weekend is June 30th through July 4th. So it's often kind of an apples to oranges comparison. But let's look technically at the highest performing films for the July 4th long weekend. The best July 4th weekend right now actually belongs, unadjusted for inflation, to Minions: The Rise of Gru from last year with a $123 million debut. Then Transformers: Dark of the Moon from July 1st to the 4th, 2011 at $115.8 million. Spider-Man 2 made $115.8 million just behind Transformers: Dark of the Moon from July 2nd through the 5th, 2004. Then back in 2017, Despicable Me did the 5-day thing from June 30th to July 4th at $99 million. And the Twilight Saga Eclipse back in 2010 from July 2nd through the 5th made $83.6 million. Now, if Dial of Destiny performs about or just a little above expectations, it could take that number 5 spot away from the Twilight Saga Eclipse, which some people would say like, oh, cool, one of the 5 highest grossing July 4th weekends of all time. Well, yeah, but if you make The Last Indiana Jones Adventure and you are struggling to supplant a 13-year-old Twilight sequel for one of the best July 4th weekends of all time, again, I don't really think you're achieving your objective. This is something that I did last year, and I'll bring it back a few times this year, basically looking at my local market and the movies that are available. This is the July 4th movie schedule, so these are the options that people here will have, and I think it's probably reflective of a lot of the, not metropolitan cities, but the more average cities that don't have a lot of the expanded films. We lost a theater here, so we're down to 5 theaters, 60 screens, and 260 showtimes for July 4th. This is what's showing today. Indiana Jones is the biggest movie in the market. It has 15% of all available shows, 39 total showtimes today, followed by Ruby Gillman at 12%. So 27% of my market is being taken by 2 pretty big disappointments box office wise. With 9% of the market is Sound of Freedom, which is a movie that's going to put up some surprising grosses in the next week or so. I'm going to talk about it at the end of the show. 9% of the market belongs to Elemental, along with The Little Mermaid, which is actually kind of surprisingly hanging around here. 23 showtimes for both Elemental and The Little Mermaid. No Hard Feelings is right behind. Across the Spider-Verse, which is the number 3 movie in the country, kind of lagging behind here in my market. Only 8% of total showtimes are for that film. The Flash has 17 total at 6% of the market, followed by Transformers with 6%. Asteroid City has 5% of the local market, followed by Past Lives and The Blackening. And then all other movies account for 5%, but it's not that many. That's 12 showtimes. It's basically, I think, a few for Guardians Volume 3, a couple for Fast X, and some older movies. There's a lot more to break down, but before we do that, I'd like to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. You know, one frustration nearly every mobile customer shares is trying to figure out just what's on your plan. I was working with my mom to try to sort out her mobile plan for weeks, trying to figure out which plan saves her the most money, and it was an absolute mess, and she ended up switching over to Mint Mobile because it's simple. Mint Mobile offers premium wireless starting at just $15 a month, no binding contracts or ridiculous promotions, no charges that you won't find out about until you get your bill. Every plan at Mint Mobile is straightforward, easy to understand, and delivers exactly what you pay for. Mint Mobile gives you the best rate whether you're buying for one or a family, and at Mint, families start at 2 lines. All plans come with unlimited talk and text plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network, and you can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and keep your same phone number along with your existing contacts. Get premium wireless from just $15 a month with no unexpected surprises at mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Seriously, you'll make your wallet very happy at mintmobile.com/Murrell. This episode is brought to you by AG1, a daily foundational nutrition supplement. We are in the dog days of summer, which means it's a time for gathering with friends and also a perfect time to make sure that you're firing on all cylinders. You want to have energy for all those summer activities. I drink AG1 every morning, and it's because my days are getting crazier. The channel keeps me busy. I'm planning a wedding. The last thing I want to think about is taking a bunch of different supplements, and it's important for me to keep things on track when it comes to my immune system, gut health, and so much more. I've struggled in the past with keeping to a routine, much less trying to remember which supplements I need to take and what amounts which days, but drinking AG1 is as simple as drinking a glass of water. It's 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day, and that's it. Each scoop of AG1 is packed with vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients when I'm home. And I also have some single serving AG1 travel packs so I never have to miss a day, even when I'm on the go. It's just that simple. If you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 today and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/Dan. That's drinkag1.com/Dan. Check it out. So let's take a closer look at the per theater averages for this past weekend. And the number one film is Contempt, which is what a lot of people had for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, but it is also a landmark film by Jean-Luc Godard. It's celebrating its 60th anniversary with a 4K restoration. It played on one screen and brought in $14,469 in that one theater. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is in second place with $13,124 per theater in each of its 4,600 theaters. Carry On Jatta 3 is in 95 theaters and brought in almost $11,000 per theater. It is a Punjabi language franchise that started back in 2012. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is at number 4, bringing in just over $3,500 in 3,405 theaters. And then Elemental is in 5th place, bringing in $3,323 in each of its 3,650 theaters. Looking at the top films in limited release, meaning 1,000 theaters or fewer, at number 1 is Past Lives, which did actually make it to my market this past weekend. I was very excited that I got a chance to see it. $1.5 million in 906 theaters. If it keeps expanding, then it will go over the limited release threshold this upcoming weekend. Carry On Jatta 3 is at number 2 with just over $1 million in 95 theaters. Okay, in 120 theaters, making $238,647 is the Indian film, and I'm going to apologize in advance, Samajava Ragamana, which is a Telugu language film out of India. It's a comedy film, and I'm not going to say the title again. I'm sure I messed it up enough the first time. In 4th place is the documentary Everybody, which played in 255 theaters for a total of just over $150,000. It's a documentary about intersex people and the challenges that that community has faced. And then rounding out the top 5 is You Hurt My Feelings, still in 68 theaters in its 6th week of release for a total of just over $45,000. Looking at the 10 highest grossing films in limited release this year, this is all tickets sold since January 1st. Pathaan is at number 1, Return of the Jedi is at number 2, and A Man Called Otto is at number 3. Past Lives, though, jumps onto the list thanks to its lengthy run in limited release at number 4 with $5.8 million and maybe looking to climb up the list depending on its theater count. Nefarious drops down 1 spot to number 5. Ponniyin Selvan Part 2 drops down to number 6. Women Talking drops down to 7. The Wandering Earth 2 drops down to 8. You Hurt My Feelings is at 9. Mummies is at number 10. And Beau is Afraid drops out of the top 10 altogether. Of course, this is just the portion of that movie's release when it was playing in less than 1,000 theaters. Of course, many of those movies and more are often to be seen in the independent cinemas that are scattered around the country that often have a devotion to bringing independent movies to different communities. And we have been spotlighting one each week on the show for several weeks now. Not only do we do a spotlight, but 10% of the ad revenue from the episode where we talk about a theater will then be donated to that theater because many of them are 501c3 nonprofit organizations. And this week we are talking about the Neon Theater in Dayton, Ohio, which opened in the late 1980s as the Dayton Cinema, but it's been under current management as the Neon since 2001. The Neon shows first run and independent movies as well as participating in local film festivals and staging special events, and it's just a cool looking theater. I love the design and everything. Like, I would love to go and make this my local theater if I lived in Dayton, Ohio, but I don't. If you go to the Neon this week, you'll be able to see Asteroid City and Past Lives, as well as a one-night-only screening of the documentary Vermeer, The Greatest Exhibition, and a presentation of the National Theater Live. I was watching an interview with the manager of the Neon. It was from a while ago, but he was talking about what they want to do with the theater, and he said something that kind of struck me. He said, "We want to bring good films to town." And that seems to be the mission for so many of these independent theaters that we've been talking about here on the show, and I think it's also why they are worthy of a spotlight and they're worthy of your support. So if you want to find out more about the Neon, including showtimes and how to buy tickets, you can check out their website at neonmovies.com, and if you end up going, as always, be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. Let's take a look now at the 2023 domestic box office for this year. The Super Mario Bros. Movie remains number one, and is anyone going to contest it? Maybe. $573.5 million. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 right now is at number 2, followed by Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and The Little Mermaid. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is at number 5 at $214.5 million. Its box office total is now locked domestically. John Wick Chapter 4 has also closed domestically at number 6, followed by Creed 3 at number 7. Fast X is stuck in neutral at number 8. Transformers Rise of the Beasts is at number 9. And Scream 6 is at number 10 with $108.1 million, although it looks to be the next to be slashed off that list by Barbie or Indiana Jones or one of those films. Looking at the 2023 worldwide box office, the Super Mario Bros. Movie still the only billionaire this year, $1.347 billion. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is at $824 million, followed by Fast X, which has broken $700 million worldwide, but again, the budget on that movie, very large. Full River Red's at number 4 with $673.5 million. Breaking the $600 million barrier is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, now the 5th highest grossing film of 2023 worldwide. The Wandering Earth 2 drops down to number 6. The Little Mermaid is at number 7. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is at number 8. John Wick Chapter 4 is at number 9, and Transformers Rise of the Beasts is at number 10. Now, something that I've been doing at the end of every month is looking at the total market share domestically for each studio, and it's interesting to see how it changes when you look at it, taking a few weeks off in between, because you can see what a big difference one specific movie can make to how much of the market a studio has. So let's look first at the last time we checked this, which was in the last week of May. I think it was literally May 31st. Universal had 31.67% of the market, followed by Disney at 28.2%, Paramount at 7.79%, Warner at 4.86%, Sony at 6.12%, Amazon at 6.93%, Lionsgate at 9.21%, and all other studios at 5.2%. So how have things changed in the last month or so? Well, one thing that hasn't changed is that Universal and Disney still control the market, although Disney now has the large share of the box office marketplace for 2023. This is year to date, so this includes the portion of Avatar's sales that happened in 2023. But Universal lost about 8% market share in the last month. What happened? Well, they had the Super Mario Bros. Movie in the early part of the year, but over the last month, they haven't really had anything. And when you look at their summer slate so far, it's been Fast X, which has been a domestic disappointment, and then Ruby Gillman, which also opened very low. So they lost a lot of that market share, but Disney didn't pick up a whole lot either. When you look at Disney, again, they should be in a great spot. 30% of the theatrical marketplace for this year. The problem being they've had so many hugely expensive movies that have underperformed that having that market share isn't quite enough for you to say that they've had a successful box office year all around. The studio that picked up the most market share over the last month was Sony. It has a 13% share of the market, whereas before it had just over 6%, and that is thanks to Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. It has been the one big movie this summer that has just been a box office hit domestically. There's really nothing that you have to say other than that. WB and Paramount continue to be non-competitive this year. Paramount looking to gain some steam with Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 this month. Warner has Barbie. Of course, they have big hopes there. Universal has Oppenheimer, which they have big hopes for. And then Disney has Haunted Mansion at the end of the month. Sony's biggest release this month is Insidious: The Red Door, so we could see them losing some of that ground that they've gained in the last month. But $4.4 billion total box office this year, and we will check in at the end of July to see which studio is on top and who's picked up the most market share in the last 30 days. Before we wrap up, as always, I'm going to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going to go back to June 30th through July 2nd, so the same time frame as we just saw this past weekend. In 1995, it was the 26th weekend of the year, and it saw the debut. This was a good summer. I remember this summer. This was the debut of Ron Howard's Apollo 13, starring Tom Hanks, Kevin Bacon, Bill Paxton, Gary Sinise, Ed Harris, Kathleen Quinlan. It was a great cast. $25.3 million opening in first place. In second place was Pocahontas. It made $15.9 million, technically in its third week of release, but only its second week in wide release. Its first week was in a very small number of theaters. A box office total of $67.8 million for Pocahontas. Batman Forever, which was a massive hit in the summer of 1995, was in its third week of wide release. It dropped 47.5% for a total of $15.3 million for the weekend and $135.3 million for the summer so far. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie, opened that same weekend to $13.1 million. And then, really, the flash of its time, Sylvester Stallone's Judge Dredd, a comic book misfire, opening behind Mighty Morphin Power Rangers at number 5 to $12.2 million. This was like coming off of peak Stallone, so Judge Dredd was a big embarrassment for him. Of course, when we go back this far, I don't want to just give you the numbers as they were in 1995. I want to look at how they would look in today's dollars, so we're going to hit that inflation button, and when you adjust these totals for inflation, Apollo 13 opened to an adjusted total of $50.5 million. Pocahontas was in second with an adjusted total of $31.8 million and a domestic gross of $135.3 million. Batman Forever just behind with a total of $30.5 million and an adjusted total of $268.1 million. Like I said, that was a huge summer movie. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers opening at $26.1 million and Judge Dredd at $24.5 million. And there's a lot of executives that would love to see a weekend like this again at the box office. There are a few movies that are opening this week, so let's take a look at them, and then we will do our Rotten Tomatoes Decoded segment, which is new. First of all, opening today, actually, is a film called Sound of Freedom. Now, I mentioned this earlier. It stars Jim Caviezel as a former Homeland Security agent who embarks on a personal mission to stop child trafficking in Latin America. This is poised to do some surprising box office numbers. We're talking potentially $10 to $20 million this holiday week, and we'll see how it goes into the weekend. This is a movie that wasn't on my radar at all, but this is one of those movies. It hits certain audiences in certain sectors, and it's looking to be a bit of a hit that people might look at the box office charts and say like, well, what's that movie? I've never heard of that one. Opening this upcoming Friday after the July 4th holiday, we have Insidious: The Red Door, which is directed by Patrick Wilson. He's taking the reins for this direct sequel to Insidious Chapter 2, which came out 10 years ago. We're catching up with the original cast. Also opening wide this Friday is Joyride, which has gotten positive reviews. We'll see that in a second. From director Adele Lim, who co-wrote Crazy Rich Asians and Raya and the Last Dragon. It stars Ashley Park and recent Oscar nominee Stephanie Hsu. Opening in limited release is a really interesting looking movie called The Lesson, starring Richard E. Grant, Julie Delpy, and Daryl McCormick, from veteran TV director Alice Troughton. Biosphere, the latest film from Duplass Brothers Productions, opens this upcoming weekend, starring Mark Duplass and Sterling K. Brown, directed by Mel Eslin. Amanda, the feature debut from Italian director Carolina Cavalli, opens in limited release, as does the documentary The League, which is about the legendary, celebrated Negro Leagues and the influence that they had on the game of baseball. And then also opening in limited release is the film Earth Mama, the feature debut of writer-director Savannah Leaf. So last week, I introduced a final segment called Rotten Tomatoes Decoded, where we look at the tomato meter, which is a binary fresh rotten number, and then how things can be put into a little bit more context when you instead look at the average score, which is a score from 1 to 10, because the tomato meter does kind of tend to skew critical reaction in many cases. And I tried it in one way with the kind of plotting a thing on a graph. I was trying to visualize it in a certain way, and I agree, it was kind of confusing. So I'm trying something different, and let me know if you think this works better. So this, first of all, are some current and upcoming releases by the tomato meter score. So this is the fresh rotten meter that you see displayed prominently on the Rotten Tomatoes page. Now, the good news is that these are movies that have come out in the last 3 weeks or so. There's a couple of big streaming movies on here as well. Nothing right now is in rotten territory. The lowest is The Flash, which currently has 64% on the tomato meter, followed by Ruby Gillman and No Hard Feelings at 68%. Indiana Jones is at 69%. It's actually been climbing in critical estimation in the last few days. Asteroid City's at 74%, Elemental's at 76%, and Extraction 2 is at 79%. Then we have The Blackening at 86%, and then clustered right up here near the top, we have Nimona, which is 93% fresh on Netflix. We have Across the Spider-Verse, which is 96% fresh, and then Joyride and Past Lives both tied at 97% fresh. So if you're just looking at the tomato meter, then you would look at Nimona, Across the Spider-Verse, Joyride, and Past Lives and say, well, the critics like those movies about equally, but that's not exactly the case, and that's why I like doing this. So let's take this chart, which is showing you the tomato meter score, and let's look at these movies by average rating. So a rating from 1 to 10. And the real thing to look at is Ruby Gillman. Ruby Gillman is currently at 68% fresh on the tomato meter, but when you look at its average score, it's at a 5.9, which would technically be rotten on the tomato meter. So what does that indicate? It indicates that the critical reviews for Ruby Gillman are much more mixed to positive than positive. So if you're looking at just the tomato meter number, it kind of skews the positivity of that film from how most critics think. Then we have No Hard Feelings, The Flash, Indiana Jones and Elemental, and Extraction 2, which are all between 6.1 and 6.6. Asteroid City is a little higher at 6.9. Then we have The Blackening at 7.1. But look at where Joyride is. Joyride has an average critical rating of 7.8, which is significantly lower than the 97% fresh that it has. And this is why I say it can be a little bit deceptive when you look at just the tomato meter number, because 97% fresh means that 97% of critics gave it a positive review, but it doesn't say how positive. So how positive have the reviews on Joyride been? Well, they've been good reviews, but 7.8 as far as the average rating is below Nimona at 7.9, below Across the Spider-Verse at 8.6, and way below Past Lives at 9.1. Their tomato meter scores are the same. They're both at 97%, but when you look at the critical average score for Joyride versus Past Lives, critics liked Past Lives significantly more, not by percentage, but by quality, than they did Joyride. So this is why I do this little exercise, because things like Ruby Gillman going from fresh to rotten, or Joyride going from tied to Past Lives to a 1 point plus behind it as far as average rating. That's what I think the advantage is of looking at Rotten Tomatoes this way. And so let me know if this is a bit easier for you to interpret visually. I can keep working on and tweaking the design, but this is kind of a fun thing, so I think I'm going to keep doing it. That does actually wrap it up. This has been a long show, but we've also had a lot to talk about. Thank you so much for watching this extra long edition of Charts with Dan. Get back to your barbecue if you're here in the US. Get back to work if you're outside the US. Be sure to stay tuned right here on the channel. Movie news, reviews, streaming charts. Who knows what's going to happen here on the... I don't even know what I'm going to be doing later this week, but trust me, I'll be here doing something. I appreciate you spending your time with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.